So let's begin. My name is Araceli Tinajero. I am a professor at the City College of New York and at the Graduate Center. And welcome to the Bildner Center. It is our pleasure to have you here with us, virtually with us. And we hope to see you very soon on campus. So we are very excited about this panel. Because we are celebrating two books by Professor Paul Julian Smith. So basically, the panel looks at the state of Mexican media in the 21st century. And also, as I just said, I celebrate two publications. One of them is Multiplatform Media in Mexico, which was published in 2019. And the other one is Mexican Gender and Genre, which is coming, it just came out this week. Our speakers are going to talk for 20 minutes, each of them. And after that, we are going to have a session of questions and answers. So our first speaker is my distinguished colleague, Professor Jerry Carlson, and he's the director of the Cinema Studies program in the Department of Media Communication and Arts at the City College of New York. He's also a professor at the Graduate Center. And he's going to talk about crime at the border in two independent films. Jerry, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Araceli, and she's my distinguished colleague as well. I just want to make it clear. It's always a pleasure to be introduced. So my subject is actually, my 20 minutes is going to be divided about in half, because I'm going to talk for the first half about the context, what precedes the production of these films, and certain traditions of the representation of the border and crime at the border, to give a kind of context for the appreciation of the two independent films, both of which were made in the 21st century. Those two films, just as a preview of coming attraction, those two films are John Sayles' Go For Sisters and Gabrielle Ripstein's 600 Miles. But before we get to those films made in the last within the last decade, I want to have a step in the Wayback Machine all the way to 1939, to one of the great classics of American cinema. I'm going to talk about three American films and then talk about Mexican and American cable and television series that portray something. So to begin with three very important American films, in 1939, John Ford makes Stagecoach, which is generally considered to be a masterpiece of American filmmaking. And many of you may have seen it, and it is literally the story of a group of people who are moving from one frontier town to another on a stagecoach. It has representative characters, and one of the things it does is it has very little psychological depth of the characters, but the characters represent different aspects of North American culture as it's being created in the 19th century. And one of the features of the film is that it reveals the enormous hypocrisy of American culture in the 19th century. In a number of ways, and I could talk about that for 20 minutes, but the point being that a very young John Wayne becomes our protagonist. He has been unjustly incarcerated and has escaped, and a friendship, indeed romance, he develops over this journey is with a young woman who is being driven out of town because manifestly she's a prostitute, even though they can't use that word in the film. At the end of the film, there is a very strong resolution to the vengeful task of avenging his family who had been killed that he does. And the end of the film is their escape to Mexico. That the corruption of American culture in its formation in the 19th century has been shown, And the promise, we never see them get to Mexico, but the promise is that there is another place across the border, and perhaps there's a second chance to remake something, that this is a different frontier in which everything that's been revealed about the frontier of North America, in which they have a genuine chance. So it's, it's a promise, not something that is a given, but it ends very distinctly on this note that Mexico is not negative. Mexico may be the second chance in the Americas. Now, manifestly, it's set in the 19th century. This is before the Mexican Revolution, et cetera, et cetera. The second film, so this sets one little trope of the fact, is Mexico the place where you escape to a second chance and a paradise from corruption in the United States. A second film that I would like to discuss is from 1969 and is Sam Peckinpah's masterpiece, The Wild Bunch. And this is a film about a gang of, desperados, as we would say, who are bank robbers. But the setting is just before World War I. And as a consequence, industrial world is impinging upon the frontier and upon the border. And they are involved in a bank robbery that goes bad, and they must flee to Mexico, which will be their safe haven. And they arrive at the border. There's a bridge there. One of the members of the gang is Mexican. He's their guide into Mexico. And he says, Mexico lindo. And one of the desperados says, I don't see what's so lindo about it. And they ride across the bridge, and they ride right into the Mexican Revolution. So it's like this response to, okay, it's all going to be simpler on the other side of the border. And they're in the midst of the Mexican Revolution. But it is a hopeful vision, because in fact, they find their redemption there. Eventually, they side with the indigenous people who are themselves victims of the warring factions of the Mexican Revolution, and they sacrifice themselves for the betterment of those people and find actually a moral center which they had never had. Both of these films are easily available on streaming. I highly recommend them. To leap forward to the 21st century, I would just like to mention the Coen brothers' No Country for Old Men, based upon the Cormac McCarthy novel. This is a much heralded, as it should be, film, in which I'm going to say this is a film that is and is not about the real border, because it's a film that's much more, in my view, while it takes place on the border, it's much more a kind of film that's both a morality tale and a kind of metaphysical tale about evil, in which the historical determinants of the characters are less emphasized in the film than the way in which, I will actually give very briefly a Freudian interpretation. It's as if, which I don't do much that frequently, as a couple of my friends know, but it's of the three main characters, it's as if one of them is the id, the other is a failed is a failed ego formation, and the sheriff is the superego who can't come to terms with these other forces that are there. So we see, in these three films, paradise or not paradise, complicated, and then you see also a way in which the border is abstracted in certain way from its actual historical or socioeconomic circumstances for other things to be explored. But not much of this is looking very much at the experience of the people who live on the border as a porous site, an historically porous site. So what I'd like to jump ahead to is something that has become very popular in 3 iterations of the 21st century. And that is, we begin with the novel from 2002, La Reina del Sur by Arturo Perez Reverte, which is a story of a young Mexican woman whose boyfriend is involved in the drug trade of the border, and he is killed, and she, because of the violence of this, is going to be targeted. So she must not only defend herself, but I mean, she must reinvent herself. And in the manner, I would call her the Scarlett O'Hara of the drug trade of the border, so that she has surrounded by overwhelming circumstances of challenge, and she rises to the occasion. How far does she rise to the occasion? Well, to the degree that she could be called the queen, La Reina. She becomes a major drug lord herself. And as a consequence, she becomes someone of great interest to Mexican television as a property to option. And so she first premieres as a telenovela in 2011, 9 years later. And her, I would call them anti-heroic, because she is an anti-heroine, but her anti-heroic adventure as a achieving neo-capitalist female protagonist takes up 63 episodes. So that's taking up a lot of space in terms of how you're portraying the border, the drug trade of the border, and its international webs. So Hollywood has never neglected the success of series made elsewhere in the world. So in 2016, La Reina del Sur becomes the Queen of the South and is now in a dominantly English language version and premieres on USA Network, and is now finished its 4th season and has 65 episodes of the adventures of Teresa Mendoza and her conquest not only of the border, but of the international drug trade, and her survival against some of the meanest dudes you have ever seen or met in your life. And that includes people not only along the border, but that includes people as far away as Malta, okay, as well as more mundane places like Miami, and this is both series fully partake of all of the major conventions of the serial melodramatic narratives of the telenovela. Most importantly, I think, is simply the fact that she is supposed to be a heroine who comes from among us. That is, she's supposed to be the young girl who makes good, but in fact, in a kind of typology of protagonist, clearly she is not from among us, apart from the events, but that she has sets of, they're not supernatural powers, but they are skills of cunning and intelligence that make her very attractive as a kind of trickster, but that take us out of our world in some ways. I bring this up, La Reina del Sur, Queen of the South, because I think the 2 films I want to talk about are actually, if you look at the kind of ecology of all of these narrative forms, they're very much a response to this. I mean, they don't say I'm responding, directly to this. It's not like a parody that's making fun of something or a new version. But in that whole discursive world, They're saying there's another way to look at this. There's all kinds of things that are, you might say, are just not true, but you could also say that are simply neglected by the genre needs here, and that they really need to be addressed. So the two films I'm going to talk about, one is Mexican in origin, though they are both cross the border, and they are both have cooperative crews in terms of their production. But one, the capital comes from the Mexican side of the border and is defined as a Mexican film. In the other, the capital comes from the United States, but is defined actually as a co-production. Both are films made for under $1 million, and they might be considered kind of chamber pieces in the sense that they have very reduced cast lists, reduced number of characters, and I'm going to talk about their distinctiveness for a few minutes, but I want to talk a little bit about what they both do that I think is common. First of all, they are anti-heroic versions of the border and the relationship of crime to the border. And our protagonists in these films they may be intelligent, they may survive, but they have no special skills other than the skills that you and I might have. And so we are very much drawn into protagonists who are problem solving, but they're problem solving from within a sphere of experience that we can directly relate to. They also are films that are very much concerned with restoring the experience of the border to the level of individual human experience. That it's not about characters that can be stereotyped as the gangster, the this or the that, but we're very much brought down to the level of individual human beings. Both of the films reject the facile binarisms, the facile binaries, such as Mexico, USA, or hero, villain, that drive much of the genres themselves, and much of the non-artistic discourse about the border that's always set up as these binaries. And very importantly, these are films that highlight how the experience of the border is deeply inflected by who you are racially, because the border is racialized, who you are, and this is something Americans frequently avoid, who you are in terms of class, not just race, but class, and of course, it's a very gendered experience of the border as well as presented in the films. One way of just summarizing this is that these are films dedicated to an immersion in the quotidian as a path to understanding the border, and this would be in contradistinction to the melodramatic genres that are very interested in in a kind of voyeurism of a spectacle of violence, when certainly violence is a regrettable and terrible part of the border these days. So, Go For Sisters, John Sayles' film from 2013. This is not the first film that John Sayles has made on the border. A number of years earlier, he made the classic Lone Star, and he has shot two other films in Mexico, La Casa de los Bebés, about the adoption system, as well as Men with Guns, that takes place in a mythical Central American environment. He is a bilingual filmmaker, though a North American. Very, very briefly, there's going to be a couple of plot spoilers in my talk, so apologies for that. Very briefly, the plot is about a African-American female parole officer who discovers that her son, an ex-Marine, a veteran of Iraq, Afghanistan, whom she's a bit disaffected from, has disappeared. And she sets out to find what has happened to her son. And as a parole officer, obviously she knows a whole world of criminality, because that's who she deals with, is people who have been released from prison. And by coincidence, a childhood friend of hers has been released to her, a woman, another African-American woman who has been in prison. She is about to reject that woman in the sense of saying, I can't be your parole officer because I can't be the parole officer of anybody I know. But by coincidence, it arrives, and she takes up the woman saying, you know things, you're closer to things of crime along here in Southern California than I am. So will you help me find my son? And they eventually find someone who will help them, a disgraced police officer, played by Edward James Olmos, I might add, named Freddie Suarez. And so our three detectives, two African-American women and a Latino former policeman, set off to find the son. This leads them to the border and to the notion that he is across the border. And this is where they do cross the border. They shoot much of the film. About half of the film is shot in Mexico. And when they get to Tijuana, one of the great, John Sayles is a great writer of dialogue. One of the things is, they said, one of the African American women has never been there before, though she's from Southern California. She said, "Is this Mexico?" And the officer turns to her and he says, "No, TJ is not Mexico. It's a theme park built for bad behavior." And what we get is a bit of a tour of Tijuana itself, with a set of scenes that are contrasting with, or no, contrasting is wrong, comparing with the life they've come from on the US side. And one of the mirror effects of the plotting of the film is that Fontaine, the African American woman who's been in prison, who's a very sympathetic character, and who has been involved with the drug trade on the US side of the border, is that we come to learn how toxic the environment is on the north side of the border. How much, the import exportation is an entangled affair. And so she is not a privileged woman because she comes from North America in any sense. In fact, she's a little bit dazzled by some of the charms of TJ when she gets there. But Sayles wants to complicate this even further. So one of the things that's revealed, 2 minutes left? 2 minutes left. Okay. Oh, well, I'll do this very fast. So first of all, the people who've done the kidnapping aren't Mexican. They're Chinese smugglers. They go to Mexicali. They find out that Mexicali has a long tradition of relationship with China and of smuggling, and of smuggling there. And so to summarize this, and then I'll do the other film in 1 minute again, apparently. So the border ends up being multi-dimensional, multi-directional, and multinational, and completely defies a binary opposition. 600 Miles is about young men from Mexico in cooperation with other young men who come to the United States to buy guns where it's easy to buy in Arizona, and to smuggle the guns back into Mexico to arm and fuel the cartels and gang wars there. So it is actually about the exportation of toxic materials from the United States to Mexico. Our protagonist in this particular film is a teenage young Mexican man who is in essence under economic pressure from his family, because his mother is a widow, to do this. And he's also under enormous pressure because he has a gender fluidity, it turns out. And so this is also the way that he can provide for his mother, but also he can prove his masculinity and fit into the culture by performing these particular tasks. On the US side of the border, an AFT officer tries to arrest him. It goes bad, and he ends up in an involuntary kidnapping of the AFT officer played by Tim Roth. They cross into Mexico, and that's where things and the manner of the sales film further complicate themselves. Every turn is that it's very difficult. You can physically know where the border is, but where one influence ends and another influence begins is very difficult to perceive. I didn't manage my time well, and I apologize for that. I would just simply say that 600 Miles is available streaming. You will not regret it. It won a major prize at the Berlin Film Festival as best for feature film, and much admired. Made by Gabriel Ripstein, who is the grandson in the famous Ripstein dynasty of Mexican filmmakers. I've gone a minute over. I am sorry. I apologize. I hope we're still friends, Araceli. Okay, and thank you so much for listening to my rapidly given 20 minutes. I look forward to everything else my colleagues are going to say. And thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Jerry. Wonderful talk. Thank you. I can't wait to see a couple of the films that you just mentioned. Again, we are today celebrating two books by Professor Paul Julian Smith. The one is Multiplatform Media in Mexico, which was released in 2019, and Mexican Gender and Genre, which just has been released. So our next speaker is Professor Paul Julian Smith, who's a distinguished professor of comparative literature at the Graduate Center. He's an author of several books, actually more than 20 books. So very productive colleague, also not only distinguished but extraordinary colleague at the Graduate Center. So he's going to talk about Mexican genders, Mexican genre, cinema, TV, and streaming since 2010. Thank you, Paul.
So I'd like to thank the Bildner for hosting, and I'd like to thank Araceli, Professor Tinajero, for making this event happen. So I'm so delighted to be here with my friends and colleagues, Dr. Carlson and Dr. Ryan. And there are a couple of connections between my talk and Jerry's that maybe we can talk about when we have the questions at the end. So mine is going to be rather dull, I think, because I'm just going to read a summary of the two books, 400 pages in 20 minutes. But to make it a little bit more ameno, pleasant, I have some images here. So I'm going to share my screen, and you can look at the pictures. They're all pictures from the two books. I hope while I'm talking. Is that right, Araceli? Okay. So this is the cover of the first book with beautiful papel picado. Multi-Platform Media in Mexico, Growth and Change since 2010 is the first book to treat the interconnected fields of cinema, television, and transmedia in Mexico over the last decade. The book combines industrial analysis of a major audiovisual territory, that is Mexico, with close readings of significant text on all screens, big and small, theatrical, broadcast, and digital. It's also based on local reporting on the ground, as in the chapter documenting media response to the 2017 earthquake, because I happened to be there during the 2017 earthquake. The first time, I think, the book also draws on star studies, tracing the profiles of actors who migrate from one medium to another. Now, Mexican film studies in English tends to focus on a small number of contemporary, internationally distributed auteurs, or on the consecrated historical period of the Golden Age. In Mexico itself, where film studies is mainly historical and TV studies mainly quantitative, there is little tradition of close textual analysis. So this book attempts to shift and expand the focus of research in that beyond auteur, cinema, and television statistics, it analyzes a wide range of media and texts from the last decade. Although it does examine some international favorites, such as the documentary features which play the festival circuit, it mainly pays close attention to what the great mass of Mexicans themselves prefer to watch, from mainstream film comedy to popular daily TV drama and web series. The book treats recent material, which is often well known to modern Mexican audiences, but unfamiliar to foreign scholars, and has yet to receive academic attention. And it's not moving. For some reason, the image is not moving. So maybe I'll go back.
Excuse me, Paul. I think we have a little bit of a problem with the audio. Jerry, can you hear me?
Jerry's on mute.
Oh.
You can't hear me?
Oh, now I can hear you. Now it's better. Now it's better.
Okay, I'll just lean forward a bit, and okay. I'll play the images like this because when it's on full screen, it didn't seem to be working.
Okay.
So part one of the book addresses cinema. The opening chapter on film explores the industrial context, 2 festivals. The first, San Sebastian in Spain, of course, a bridge between Spain and Latin America. The second, Guadalajara, the main industry event in Mexico. And 2 of Mexico's public film institutions located in Mexico City, the Cineteca Nacional, which you can see here, and the Centro de Capacitación Cinematográfica, one of the 2 official film schools. By focusing on production, distribution, and exhibition, this reportage sets the scene for the more textual chapters that follow. The second chapter is called Sex Docs. It contrasts 2 documentaries by first-time female filmmakers, which focus on the unexplored topic of sex and aging. The image here is from Bellas de Noche on Showgirls of the 1970s by Maria Jose Cuevas in 2016. And this image is Plaza de la Soledad on sex workers in their 70s by Maya Godet in 2016. I also offer an archive-based account of the vedettes of the first film, such as Lin May and Wanda Seux, who boasted surprisingly durable careers. The third chapter on cinema treats a recent trend in Mexican mainstream film, comedies in which it is not the homosexual, but the homophobe who is the butt of the joke. The films here are Macho by Antonio Serrano, 2016, which you see here, and Hazlo como Hombre, Nicolas Lopez of 2017. This chapter interweaves the sexual theme with that of urban space, arguing that the city is inextricable from new gender identities. The stars examined here are Miguel Rodarte, who you saw in the previous image, and Mauricio Ockman, who you see on the left here, reacting badly to the news that his friend is gay in the shower at the gym. So they are previously and incongruously known for their macho and heterosexual romantic roles. Part 2 of the book shifts to TV fiction. The first chapter on television charts the emergence in Mexico of a genre that is well established elsewhere. That is the women in prison drama. It contrasts the Mexican series Cappadocia, which you see here, HBO Latin America from 2008 to 12, with a Spanish version of the same theme, Vis a Vis, Antena 3, 2015 to 19, which you can see on Netflix in the US. The performers studied here are Dolores Heredia and Ana de la Reguera, you can see on the right here, who plays the prison director and main inmate. So again, this was the first HBO series in Mexico. The second TV chapter is on anthology dramas, called in Mexico Unitarios. This is a genre overshadowed by the better-known genre of telenovela. The chapter analyzes 2 daily series broadcast in the early evening, which are massively popular with Mexican audiences and much despised by critics. The image you see here is from La Rosa de Guadalupe, of a gay son with his mother. And it's the much parodied moment which happens in every episode where a celestial breeze comes, showing the presence of the Virgin blessing the characters. But there is another show, less known, shown even earlier in the evening, called Como Dice el Dicho. And so both of these shows have had several gay episodes, arguing that they serve a pedagogic functioning, working through urgent social issues such as teenage homosexuality for their young viewers. The chapter also traces how the series have functioned as a school for novice actors who are a focus for fans on social media. So I trace the social media footprint. This relates to Jerry, this image. The final chapter on TV is called New Platforms, New Contents, and it's devoted to a series called Run, Coyote, Run. It's in Spanish, but the title is Run, Coyote, Run. And it was the first series made by Fox Latin America in 2017. So this is for paid television, but it had a huge audience. This is a comedy that treats the potentially traumatic topic of people smuggling. You can see the wall, the border wall behind. It argues that the novel format of the series, it's not a telenovela, it's a series, which is distinct from the coarse sitcoms and sketch shows commonly aired by Televisa, is inextricable from its new distribution on pay TV and by app. The star studied here, you can see him on the left, is Harold Torres, who was previously known as the lead in leftist and indie filmmaking. Most of the actors I'm studying move between film, TV, and streaming. He's currently on a Netflix show, Harold Torres. Part 3 is devoted to multi-platform media. The first chapter is based once more on on-site reportage. It treats 2 examples of media crossover. In the first half of the chapter, we see how film and TV production is crafted to coincide with the Mexican calendar and its Day of the Dead festivities. In the second half, live theater shows recreate TV successes in Mérida, Yucatan, and Mexico City. So these are records of my nights, not just watching TV, but also attending the theater and being excited to see the show, the stars, TV stars in person. So the shows I treat are Musical Talent Contest Parodiando from Televisa in 2015 and Telenovela Mi Corazón es Tuyo from Televisa 2014 to 15. So adaptations from small screen to stage that span diverse genres. The stars examined here are beloved veteran Angelica Maria, who for some reason is a great favorite with drag queens. So she turns up in Parodiando. And here, a younger star, Polo Morin, you see in the telenovela. He is a telenovela juvenile with a controversial past. Both of these stars went through sex scandals in their different periods. And both serve as images of and for teenagers in very different decades. The second multi-platform media chapter is called Earthquake Media. This chapter is also based on reportage, beginning with an account of television coverage minutes after the massive earthquake on September the 20th, 2017. Because after the earthquake, I didn't go outside as I should have done. I sat and I watched television and was very interested in what I saw. It continues with a survey of media on the anniversary of the disaster 1 year later. Here is a film called El Día de la Unión, which was released to coincide with the anniversary of the earthquake and is about the earthquake in the 1980s. This chapter tracks how film institutions, TV programming, and social media tackled the aftermath of the tragedy. It focuses especially on the charity set up by transnational superstar actors Gael Garcia Bernal and Diego Luna, and also mentions the role of presenters of Televisa's long-running morning show, Hoy, Today. which is so integrated into the daily lives of Mexican viewers. Normally devoted to celebrity gossip and trivial banter, in these special circumstances of the earthquake, the presenters left the studio to participate in rescue work or chaired uncomfortable discussions with visiting seismologists or trauma specialists. If you've ever seen Boy, you realize how bizarre this was. The final chapter on multi-platform media is on the genre known as network narrative. It deals with feature film Vive por mí, which you can see here, Cheme la Peña 2017, and web series Sincronía, Blim 2017. This is a genre well established in Mexican films since at least the first features of Alejandro González Iñárritu. The network narrative boasts multiple plot strands and a diverse cast who intersect after a random event. The chapter also engages with the essay film, arguing that the fictional network narrative can also serve as a form of social commentary. The two texts featured here are a dramatic feature starring Marta Higareda, who you see here, probably the most important woman in Mexican cinema, known for romantic comedies with a fluffier tone, which she writes, produces, and stars in. And also the first drama series made for Televisa's internet platform, which features Maria Rojo, who is a film actress with a high political profile. Indeed, she is a politician. This is a very interesting series because you can watch the episodes in any order. So it really takes advantage of the streaming format. It's the only series I know that does that. So I'm going very fast, but here's the second book with a lovely image from the series Malinche, which was on Netflix at one point here in the US. Anyway, so as you can tell from the title, Mexican genders, Mexican genres, cinema, television, and streaming since 2010. This stresses even more than the previous book, the theme of gender and sexuality. So the main focus of the second book is mass culture in contemporary Mexico, as expressed in fiction formats, from the still distinct but rapidly converging audiovisual art forms of theatrically released cinema, free-to-air television, and streaming platforms. Of course, with the pandemic, they're totally converged. It also pays attention to the social media footprint of the text it studies. So there's more about internet in this book than in the previous one. Mexican genders, Mexican genres analyzes industries and practices, tracking how changes in producers and genres, for example, the relative decline of still hegemonic Televisa and of the heritage telenovela, which is still very popular, coincide with changes in gender representations, for example, the relative rise of feminist and queer narratives across different media. In its corpus of primary text, this work also aims to move beyond the auteur film that is little seen by Mexicans, but much studied by Mexicanists abroad. The introduction sets out some of my sources for the Mexican audiovisual ecology since 2010 in the three media, and ends with a piece of reportage on the media reception in Mexico City in early 2019. So I went to Mexico City and I just saw what was popular at the time. And this is one of the biggest grossing films of all time in Mexico, commercial comedy Mi Reyes contra Godines. Conversely, here is an indie drama, Los Años Azules, very low budget and grungy. And here we have an interesting new TV sitcom called Mi Lista de Exes, which was on Televisa after news, so late night, and a very different kind of comedy for Televisa, to use an adult comedy in all senses. The first section of the book again deals with cinema. Its first chapter examines the emergence of an outspoken feminist heroine in three romantic comedies starring a woman actor with a new profile in the genre, Fernanda Castillo. She was not very well known before, and these all came out, these three films, in the same year. So in Una Mujer Sin Filtro, she cannot help saying what she really thinks. The second, and here, Mi Pequeño Gran Hombre, you can see she looms over her suitor. And here, Ya Veremos, she plays a a woman who is separated from her husband, although they're brought together by the sick child. There's a lot of melodrama in it. The second chapter analyzes 4 mainstream comedies starring a male actor who is currently the biggest box office attraction in the country and moves between cinema, television, and the web. And he's called Omar Chaparro, here imitating a Golden Age star who you may recognize. So the fact that one of his projects is this one, a Netflix original, enables, como Caído del Cielo, a comparison between the heritage media feature film and the upstart streaming service as they compete for cultural proximity with a newly reconstituted Mexican audience. But I also treat films where he shares billing with Marta Higareda, who mentioned before, but she gets top billing. She is the writer and the producer, but they're battle of the sexes films, as you can see here. And No Manches Frida is another one. These are amongst the seen by many millions of people, and Marta Higareda in her year was the biggest box office attraction in Mexico. This is all about popular film. The third chapter, based on reportage in 3 Mexican film festivals, showed how these events preserve their cultural distinction by distancing themselves from the popular culture, which engages the broader public, even as they employ affective strategies that seek to connect with specialist audience. So I'm reading festivals in the light of affect theory. This is Morelia, which, as you know, is the main art cinema festival. And the beautiful, it plays on colonial city. This is Guadalajara, where you have a charro, but it's more of a commercial festival, if you like, much bigger than Morelia, and with a market. And here we have the Mix Festival, Festival de Diversidad Sexual, which is a queer festival that has been running for 20 years now. And they have on their cover probably Mexico's best known gay porn star. So they're trying to make to create an audience. All of the festivals try to create an audience, and they do so, in this case, by appealing to pornography as well as art, which is a very delicate balance. The second section, also 3 chapters, addresses broadcast television and its convergence with the internet, focusing mainly on female TV showrunners. People say, why are there so few women directors of cinema in Mexico? And I would say, why are there so many women showrunners in television? Because there are quite a few. The chapter treats the emergence in traditional telenovela of the genre's first teen gay couple, Aristemo, whose media footprint spread to new style TV series, theater, and pop music. So that was indeed multi-platform. This is a long-delayed first kiss in Oaxaca for Aristemo. It was the biggest internet phenomenon of its year. Here you see the producer in the middle with the 2 boys and the cast and crew. And here I wonder if you recognize this actress in the middle, because it is Silvia Pinal, who plays the grandmother in the series. So she gives her kind of prestige to this new kind of show. This is actually a series based on the 2 boys when they moved to Mexico City and lived together. So Mexicans often say to me, oh, we're so conservative. And I think, well, maybe that's not true. These are all Televisa shows seen by many millions of people. The second chapter treats the remaking of Cuna de Lobos. Many Mexicans here will remember Cuna de Lobos, a classic telenovela of the 1980s. And it was remade by a female executive producer, Giselle Gonzalez, who updated the format with a new genre, short-run series once more, and new protagonists, frankly sexual women and sympathetic men. So here you see Giselle Gonzalez, the producer on the right, with the Spanish actress who plays the main role. And this is Caer en Tentación, is a previous telenovela by the same producer, which is also, it's a defense of female adultery as the right to sexual pleasure, which again, you might not expect to see on Televisa. The final chapter in this section widens the book's scope to include a more highbrow phenomenon, in this case, historical drama, also with a feminist theme made for public television. And this is Malinche by creator Patricia Avilaga. This is on public television, but it still had a big audience. And so what you see here is the main character. And what Arriaga is doing is retelling Mexican history from a feminist and feminine viewpoint. Here you see Cortez, who is not heroic at all. And here you see Malinche's village, which is, and the fact that it looks kind of run down and decrepit is the whole point, because this is, sorry, someone said something. Well, that should go in the chat if you don't mind, and then we'll come back to it. That's okay, no worries. Thank you for coming. And Arriaga has already had a series on Sor Juana. So she's going through Mexican history, feminizing, feministizing, and telling it all from the woman's point of view. So I'm just going to the end now, Araceli, not sure how long I had. The last chapter, or coda, serves as a kind of synthesis of my argument. It examines the debate around the most celebrated Mexican fiction film of the decade, Cuarón's Roma, once more a Netflix original, re-examining the extent. And so I'm not sure if you can see this, but this is a tweet by a film critic. He takes an original still from Roma of a family. Oh, se me fue. That's unfortunate. I wonder where it went. There it is. The family watching the TV set. This is the scene in the film. But what he's done is he's photoshopped Mexico's Corona czar, López-Gatell, onto the screen. You can't see, it's very small. And because it's 7 p.m., which is when the evening telenovela would normally start, and sadly, this is now when the report on the coronavirus is. So I like this image because it combines cinema, TV, and internet, social media. So this chapter places, there it goes again, the festival prize-winning, globally distributed feature in the context of contemporary multimedia narratives on the same theme, that is of middle-class women and their female servants. And I think I'm not going to be able to show you these images, so I'll stop screen sharing because it's just the last 3 images. So I take a lesser-known feature film. Stop share. Here I am again. A lesser-known feature film. It's called Hilda with an H. All of these are also on the same theme as Cuarón's Roma, that is women and their servants. Broadcast television, Crónica de Castas, starring Maria Orozco again as a maid who buys the house of her former employer, and streaming series, a truly terrible series called Like, about rich kids in Mexico City who sell drugs, but they are aided by their maid, a very independent maid. So once more, and this is to conclude, my main aim is to move critical focus away from the limited number of works that are best known abroad, and to call attention to the wider world of media contents and practices available in Mexico itself. Given the easy access to Netflix around the globe, which serves to distort research priorities for international Mexicanists, it's very easy to write about Netflix and to ignore the fact that, say, half of the population in Mexico don't have access to internet, so they are never going to see Netflix. And before the pandemic, Mexico had one of the highest rates of movie theater attendance in the world. People loved to go to movie theaters, and of course, huge rates of free-to-air television watching. Televisa is still dominant. So the access to Netflix can distort research priorities for international scholars. So it's vital to place the streamer, Netflix, within a national context where, before the pandemic at least, multiplex cinema and free-to-air television remained dominant. Thanks very much, Araceli. If I kept to my 20 minutes.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you for all the wealth of information that you give us in these 2 books. I mean, really precious. Thank you so much. I mean, we can learn so much from your findings and from your dedication to scholarship. I mean, I always say that a book is always a gift to humanity. So thank you for being so generous to all of us. Appreciate that. All right, so our next speaker is Lily Ryan. She graduated from the Graduate Center, Dr. Lily Ryan, I should say. She graduated from the Graduate Center. And at the moment, she is an assistant teaching professor of Spanish at Penn State University. So she's going to talk to us about generic transgression in contemporary Mexican film. Thank you, Lily.
Thank you, Araceli, for organizing, for the introduction, to Jerry and Paul for their great talks, especially to Paul for his invitation. I saw him present Mexican screen fictions a few years ago back at NYU, and that was the reason I applied to CUNY, so it's really nice to be here tonight. I also have a presentation with a few images, so I'm going to share my screen. This paper examines two Mexican films, Canoa and Roma, that demonstrate the interconnectedness of fiction and documentary filmmaking in Mexican cinema. Oh, looks like my screen share stopped. I'm going to try again. It's part of a larger project that looks at several films that feature documentary and fiction overlaps. In looking at Canoa and Roma in conjunction, my hope is to prove the pervasiveness of fact and fiction crossovers in Mexican cinema, the link between the 1970s and the 2000s, and the continued yet evolving international interest in the Mexican film industry. I've chosen these two bookend films for my presentation because they present interesting points of comparison and contrast in my two studied periods, the 1970s and the 2000s. Whereas the 70s are generally considered to be a weak time for Mexican cinema that produced few and low quality works, this decade is responsible for the emergence of some of Mexico's most prolific filmmakers. My project argues that the 1970s were, in fact, a critical time for Mexican cinema that produced high quality works that later would influence the globally successful films for which Mexican cinema in the 2000s has come to be known. Of course, Cuarón's Roma looks towards this critical period as it takes place in 1971. The new millennium marks a monumental time in Mexican history in which the PRI is voted out after 71 years of rule. This coincides with a boom in filmmaking that catapulted Mexican directors into national and international fame. Despite the fact that these two decades present stark differences within Mexico's political and cinematic history, my analysis demonstrates their shared aesthetic and thematic tendencies as they integrate documentary techniques into fiction works that explore the social preoccupations of each respective setting. Additionally, the academic, festival, and commercial attention given to Canoa and Roma allow me to analyze the evolution of the Mexican film industry in the last 50 years. Although these films differ greatly in their content and the ways in which documentary and fiction dialogue, there are several shared themes among them. The documentary characteristics that they possess enhance their socio-historical value while simultaneously demonstrating the versatility of filmic techniques across genre. Similarly, they both deal with historical incidents of violence from the same period. Canoa documents the 1968 Canoa massacre, in which 5 Puebla University workers were killed by rural townspeople, and Roma features the very real 1971 Halconazo shooting in its most critical sequence. After a turbulent period following Mexico's well-known golden age of the 30s and 40s, Luis Echeverría Álvarez invested greatly in cinema during his presidential sexennial. Echeverría took significant steps to catalyze the production of high-quality films, which scholar Carrie Hegarty explains included financial support for young filmmakers, the establishment of 3 state production companies, the foundation of 2 film schools, and a governmental cinema publicity department. Ignacio Sanchez Prado agrees, noting that Echeverría's sexenio represents a fundamental change and move towards political and auteur cinema, most notably in the works of Felipe Casals, Luis Buñuel, Luis Alcoriza, and Alfonso Arrau. Still, Sanchez Prado concedes that auteur filmmakers like Casals are outliers working in an industry in crisis and emphasizes the decay of popular cinema during the decade in question. Canoa is a docudrama that covers the killing of 5 rural men in the town of San Miguel de Canoa in September 1968. This term, docudrama, defined by Patricia Ofterhide as, quote, films that throughout use actors and scripts with creative license to retell true events, end of quote, was first employed in relation to Canoa upon its release in the Criterion Collection in 2017, and suggests the combination of historical fact and heightened terror within the film. Canoa is formally classified as a fiction film. However, Casals uses voice of God narration, recreated on-screen interviews, and places the action in a specific time frame by using on-screen titles. Though it was revered upon its 1975 release, and then again when it was screened at the 1998 Berlinale, Canoa has earned new recognition in recent years. It has enjoyed wider distribution thanks to its Criterion inclusion at the suggestion of Guillermo del Toro and Alfonso Cuarón. Critic Fernanda Solorzano emphasized the likeness between Canoa and horror films while still noting the film's documentary qualities. My discussion of Canoa is framed within this new consideration of its generic transgressions, and I view it as a work that anticipates contemporary society's preoccupation with blurring the boundaries of real and fictionalized drama. Canoa features distinct and easily recognizable documentary techniques. The film begins with the intertitle Esto sí sucedió, which is followed by several intertitles that situate the action at various times between September 14th and 16th, 1968. Though Canoa reads as a cohesive piece that establishes the scene of the crime, the violence, and its aftermath, it uses a range of visual registers to do so, which include 4 different opening sequences seen on this slide right here. The first, which is preceded by the intertitle mentioned above, and another situating the viewer on the morning of September 15th as a reporter answers a phone and types out the dictated facts about the recent murders. The second establishing sequence illustrates a parallel between the Independence Day parade on September 16th and the March for the Victims that took place the very same day. The third features handheld black and white footage that shows police officers stepping around the bodies of the slain. And the fourth establishing sequence reads as a typical expository documentary, as it features voiceover narration and geographical facts about the town of San Miguel de Canoa. All of these aesthetics work together to produce a work that transgresses generic categorization. There is also a clear fictionalization of the event, whether it be through the exaggerated sound of the typewriter commanded by the flustered reporters in the first scene, or the altered tone of the narrator in the fourth. The negotiation between fact and fiction that develops throughout Canoa justifies the film's categorization by some critics as a horror production, as it is a film that relies on generic transgressions and, in the words of Solorzano, quote, a film that juxtaposes styles in order to provoke a loss of control and a sense of estrangement in its audience, end of quote. This loss of control derives from the suggestion of the presence of documentary and then the transformation of this same documentary material into a highly dramatic, fictionalized recreation. Solorzano aptly names her article, The Devil in Disguise, referring to shifting perspectives that the film offers. In addition to the eerily prophetic details through which the entire film is framed, like timestamping, the multiple opening sequences, and the narrator's ongoing commentary, the camera work also suggests both the constructed nature of telling the story of the event and the dramatic arena in which it takes place. Through fiction that hinges on fact, and fact whose essence relies on the exaggerations afforded by fiction, Canoa illustrates a gaping lack of attention paid to the September 14th massacre. The many waves of renewed interest in the film, first in 1975 by a local audience, then in 1998 at the Berlinale, and finally in 2017 with its inclusion in the US Criterion Collection, it's an increasing interest in film is demonstrated for this very local wound. Though it takes on history through a different lens, Roma engages in a similar parallel between individual and collective experience. It features an indigenous protagonist who selflessly cares for an upper middle class Mexico City family in 1971. Roma was filmed in Mexico and produced by Netflix, the Hollywood-based Participant Media, and Esperanto Filmo, which is Cuarón's own production company that he runs out of Brentwood, California. It premiered at the Venice Film Festival in August 2018 and subsequently showed at 18 more film festivals around the world. Cuarón's portrayal of Cleo, the mixed-sex speaking nanny, earned him 3 Oscar awards in 2019. In addition to inciting a critical debate on the agency of Cleo and unofficially inaugurating Netflix as a major production force in international cinema, Roma boasts tremendous aesthetic value. I focused my analysis of the film on Cuarón's minute attention to detail in his realization of his own nostalgic memories. Whereas the visual registers prove crucial in Canoa, I look to sound as a critical mode of understanding both the interaction between characters and the materialization of documentary likeness in Roma. Scholars Renée Drovo and Sandra Pauletto focus on sonic strategy as a way of helping viewers identify with characters in cinema. Their case study of Cuarón's Oscar-winning Gravity from 2013 presents a convincing argument for the significance of the use of sound in the film, which was the first to include digital surround or 3D sound throughout the entire work. They argue that in the film, point of audition is just as important as point of view. They explain how Cuarón utilizes an ultrafield, stating that the ultrafield most closely replicates the continuity of sound in everyday life. As well as identification with the characters, sound plays an important role in the ontological caliber of what is seen on screen. Drovo and Pauletto state that, quote, immersive sound technology is directly connected to the aim of achieving spatial realism, an everlasting ideal that has existed since the dawn of sound in cinema, end of quote. We witnessed this oral illustration of spatial realism during the birth scene in Roma, which serves as the film's climax. After beginning labor in a furniture store in the middle of the Alconazo shooting, Cleo is rushed to the hospital in a panic. As she gives birth and then anxiously waits for a response from her baby, the soundtrack privileges Cleo's heavy breathing. Though the doctor is the only character speaking in this scene, the point of audition is clearly Cleo. It is through sound that Cuarón transmits Cleo's anxiety to the auditors and spectators, burdening them with Cleo's heartbreaking realization that her daughter is stillborn. Drovo and Pauletto state that, quote, sound lures us to become an invisible auditor, end of quote. Indeed, in this scene, Cuarón breaks the proverbial fourth wall with the subjectivity of the film's diegetic sound, allowing the spectator to become the sonic equivalent of a voyeur, someone who surreptitiously invades the private space of the film's subject. Cuarón manipulates the conventions of cinema as his sonic ultrafield is not accompanied by the rapid cuts typical to the technique, similar to what we would see in the opening sequence of Amores Perros. And instead of the 3 to 6 second average shot length favored by traditional Hollywood cinema, Roma features extremely long takes, with the opening shot clocking in at a very lengthy 5 minutes and 35 seconds. Cuarón's film rejects classical generic categorization by including these unusually long takes coupled with immersive sound. On one hand, it is a thoughtfully and meticulously designed art film that favors a hyper-aestheticization that goes beyond mere realism, such as the moving yet bizarre scene in which a man clad in a monster costume contemplates the New Year's Eve fire in the countryside. On the other, it is an intensely personal realization of autobiographical experience that seeks to recreate both the material details and the nostalgic affection of the director's childhood. Rather than work against each other, Roma's formal details, such as its black and white footage, 3D immersive sound, and long tracking shots, collaborate with the autobiographical impetus behind the work, allowing viewers to both observe and experience the reality of the characters' lives. Though Roma features masterful cinematography throughout, the film sparked cultural criticism for its production and distribution model. As Cuarón's 8th film and his first made in Mexico since his 2000 hit, Y tu mamá también, Roma provokes a questioning of the work of the three amigos and their production outside of their home country. Roma is both personal and local, as it pays homage to Libo, the woman who raised Alfonso Cuarón, and Mexico City in the 1970s. It is also an intricately designed period piece that studiously recreated the upper middle class environment in which Cuarón was raised. To the dismay of Mexican audiences, Roma premiered internationally before it arrived on the big screen in its home country. Thus, though its content is distinctly Mexican, its Netflix-controlled distribution and exhibition betray the locality of its plotline. Since Roma is an auteur retrospective that looks to the 1970s and is emblematic of the international interest, albeit selective, in Mexican cinema, it serves as a point of connection to the famed Canoa, while also inaugurating a new production model. Roma's intense focus on family life and memories, coupled with its observational footage, reiterates Cuarón's autobiographical impulse and echoes the complex audiovisual narrative propelled in Canoa. At the same time, its inclusion of the 1971 Alconazo shooting during the film's tensest moment emphasizes the reckoning with collective history present in the work. Curiously, both films use one-word titles that emphasize the local setting of each film and would be obscure to a foreign audience. However, the 3 hours and 30 years that separate the neighborhoods of Canoa and Roma's respective productions have been introduced to the global audience in very different ways. Whereas Canoa was well known at home in Mexico and has gradually become a Mexican cinema staple in international critical circles over the years, it can be argued that Roma was better known abroad before its introduction at home. Before its inclusion at the 1998 Berlinale, which resulted in a remastered VHS version of the film, Canoa was essentially a lost tape known only among the locals present at its original screenings. Its popularity is due almost entirely to festivals. Roma, on the other hand, gained international fame through Netflix's multi-million-dollar campaign that preceded the film's release, which was cause for disdain in Mexico. It is also among the most widely available Mexican films and was famously banned from Cannes. While Canoa memorializes an all but forgotten local tragedy, it can be argued that too much emphasis has been placed on Roma's quotidian plotline. In the coda to Mexican gender, Mexican genres, Paul Julian Smith analyzes El Ombligo de Giordani, or what he calls the anti-Roma, and two television plot lines that we just heard him talk about that explore similar themes. Smith implores readers to look beyond the celebrated film and to explore local titles that did not make international headlines. He reminds us that the finesse with which Mexican cinematographers work, as explored here in the well-known cases of Canoa and Roma, are mainstays of Mexican audiovisual production in both high and low culture. Smith's work is a contribution to Mexican media studies, and even amidst the problematic film and academic conditions of this pandemic, it makes us all excited to see what comes next. Thank you.
Thank you, Lady Ryan, for such a wonderful talk. So now let's, you can either raise your hand and so we can unmute you, or you can write down your questions in the chat. So I don't know if one of the panelists would like to begin with to break the ice, so we can start the conversation with the public.
Okay, I just said Philip Allen has a very cogent question in the chat there, which is for Dr. Ryan. So maybe we could deal with that first. Okay.
Yes. So the question is, do you think there is some kind of connection between the popular culture trends in the 1970s and late 2010s in Mexico that made this similar documentary fictitious style and aesthetic particularly appealing?
Yeah, thank you, Philip, for your question. So I would say, I think I could say that there is a similar investment in auteur cinema throughout the 2 decades. I'm not sure I would be able to answer to larger popular culture trends, and maybe Paul or Jerry could weigh in on that. But it's interesting because even though the cinema environment was so different in both decades, in the 70s, as I said, there are very few films that could be considered high quality. And in the 2000s, there are myriad films that were widely celebrated from Mexico. There are these similar narrative styles and crossovers between genre in the 2 decades. So I don't know, Paul, would you have more information on the popular cultural trends?
Well, I just like to call attention to one of the documentaries I read about in my book, Bellas de Noche, Beauties of the Night, which is precisely set in about the 1970s and establishes a connection between the 1970s and the present day. And so it's about vedettes, showgirls who were much loved and despised in the 70s, and then they're transformed into, I don't know, objects of I'm not sure how you would have that. It's sad, the sort of physical decay, but also there's a praise of their survival. So I think what that shows is not just the continuity of popular culture, but also the way in which legitimation or prestige varies. The vedettes films in the 70s, as I say, were much despised, and now a filmmaker could make a documentary, actually, which is also shown on Netflix, which was won prizes and is clearly taken very seriously indeed, in a way that those women were not, sadly, at the time. Bellas de Noche. I'm not sure if it's still on Netflix.
So let's see if you have a question, you can raise your hand or write it down in the chat box, please.
I wanted to just to compliment both of my colleagues for wonderful presentations, but I want to address something to Paul, because I think there's something you've talked about in the study of Mexican cinema that has a broader implications, and that is what you've rejected is actually a number of gatekeepers that people in cinema studies use. That is, a lot of the writing that happens in cinema studies, whether it be about Latin American film or about international cinema, the scholars actually depend far more upon gatekeepers of a certain kind than I think they should. And those gatekeepers tend to be one of two things. They tend to be, film festivals and the particular tastes and interests that festivals have in shaping a particular presentation, and then the second thing is what I think I'm just so happy you brought up, which is the control that distributors have. That simply they've chosen something and they choose to present it, and it goes in a certain sense unquestioned that what you're looking at is the right sample. On that. So if you talk a little bit more about that, which I think is a kind of a big methodological shift that your work is suggesting about how we should really be looking at media these days in a kind of very expanded comparativist context instead of a narrower comparativist context.
Well, thanks very much, Jerry. So it's true that in both books I have chapters on film festivals. Film festivals are established as being a field of study within general film studies, so that's not new. But what I'm interested in is not to reject them or reject the gatekeepers to us. What are the processes of legitimation? How is it that certain works are considered to be worthy of study and others are not? And I think the problem is that a lot of film studies now is very politically engaged. And so if you take art movies, which are seen by very few people in the country, and take them somehow representing Mexico, this is very problematic. And so it's a very simple thing, really, to ask what a Mexican audience is watching, particularly before the pandemic. And so I try to give in both books a kind of thick description or reportage of what was it like to go to. This is a kind of terrible nostalgia now. What was it like to go to a multiplex in Mexico City and to see a popular comedy with audiences? What was it like to see, conversely, to see Roma in Mexico City in a tiny art house, which was called La Casa del Cine. And so you could see how, in that sense, because there was a lot of competition for those tickets, as opposed to just turning on your internet and watching it on Netflix. People still wanted to see that film on a big screen, but it became part of the process of consecration, that it would be shown in La Casa del Cine, this little art house, under very strict conditions. And indeed, Lily talked about sound, that this tiny art house where they had no money, they were obliged by Cuarón or Netflix to redo their sound and make the image better to be up to the aesthetic of that film. So I'm not rejecting gatekeepers, I'm saying what are the processes of legitimation in cinema, television, and streaming, and to see how these processes are changing all the time. And this is what Bourdieu called habitus. When we live within the habitus, what is taken for granted, for example, we study art movies because they're better. And that can change because, of course, in American film studies, there's a huge tradition of studying popular films, Stagecoach, as you mentioned. And so I think that it would be, my aim is to widen the focus of Mexican film studies to embrace especially popular cinema, television, and streaming. But not just Netflix. As I said, Televisa has its own streaming platform, which is called Blim, curious name. It had actually a fantastic series on, which of course we have no access to. Sincronia is very experimental in both in its subject matter and in its form. So there were just a lot of very interesting things out there, and I'm trying to chart the audio-visual field, if you like, a cultural field, and ask questions: how do producers, texts, and institutions interact? So I would say I'm not rejecting anything. In both the books, I have sections on art film. But I have to say that a turning point, there were two turning points for me. Recently, I was asked, do you want to write an essay for a volume on Regadas? This would be in English. Carlos Regadas is a well-known art director. You know, I have nothing against him. He had a film that came out, Ex Tenebras, what was it? Ex Tenebras Lux, yeah. And so it was shown in Cannes. It was a critical hit. I happened to be in Mexico City. I went to central Mexico City to see it, and it was cancelled. And I said, you know, why? I've come all the way to see this film to the Cine Mexiana. Why is it not showing? And they said, no hay interés. There's no interest for it. And there we were in the center of a city with 26 million Mexicans, and there weren't enough people to see that film. So I came back to New York City and I saw it in Angelica, I think. And just listening to the audience, Angelica, not one person spoke Spanish. They were all Anglo people like me who had an interest in art cinema. So I thought there's such a disconnect between art cinema and local audiences, which doesn't mean, of course, we could read it aesthetically. We could talk about the interesting things in that cinema, but not to take it as representing Mexico is very problematic, I think.
Yes, it is, but you know, just an anecdote.
Post Tenebras Lux, yeah.
Just an anecdote, Paul. I went to see a Kurosawa movie in Cannes many, many years ago, and it was only my friends, 3 of them, and I who went to the cinema. So they closed it because they said, you are the only audience here, so we are going to close it tonight, okay? Come next time. So it happens, you know, in other places as well. I'm just
it happened to me in Dallas years ago. I went to a 9 o'clock feature of a French film, and I arrived and they said, sorry, you're the only person here. We're canceling the screening. So, you know.
But that was a French film. It was a French film in Texas.
It was a French film in Texas. Le Crabe Tambour, Pierre Schondorfer. Yeah, a very good film. But I was the only guy who showed up at the mall at 9 o'clock to see the French film. So they just decided to cancel the screening.
That kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I know. I wasn't happy, but it makes sense.
But to see to have a Mexican film canceled in Mexico doesn't make quite so much sense.
Correct.
Absolutely, given the you know, like I saw Saturday Night Fever, you know, I mean, it's not a film, but I saw it in Mexico City, you know, but I mean, that was massive. I mean, cinema is, I mean, it's not that cheap to go to the movies either, in Mexico. I mean, it's granted, it's not as expensive as in the United States, but still, it's, the family goes and if they take their friends or children, it can be a very expensive experience. So
yeah, it's a middle class phenomenon.
yeah,
It
that's
was a
correct.
middle class phenomenon.
All right, so we have a question here. It says, it's from Laura Pavon. In relation to Jerry's question about legitimation, I would like to ask distinguished Professor Paul Julian Smith what is, in his opinion, about the creative and aesthetic conditions of new platforms for the creation of amateur personal, spontaneous audiovisual content such as TikTok, Twitch, Instagram, or YouTube, also in the context of distribution via smartphones and global local audiences. Thank you for this wonderful question, Laura.
Thank you, Laura. I would say I haven't researched this. What I have in the books is, and this will sound antique to you after the joys of TikTok, is Twitter. Because I think the good thing about Twitter is that they are, it's a sort of very much the most committed fans are still posting on Twitter, and so there are conditions of a possibility there for community making amongst fans of TV shows. And one thing I follow in the second book is the social media footprint of those episodes on Televisa of gay teen romance and what that means to local audiences. And I have a methodology for doing that, which I could share with you if you like. But what I was struck by is that people do reflect on their own position in relation to the fiction in quite a sophisticated way, even as they are building connections with a fan community. So I showed you, I think two of the pictures were of a young actor called Joaquin Bondoni. And this was something that appeared to arise spontaneously, was because of his gay character was bullied in the show, fans started wearing blue ribbons to school. And the hashtag, which was not created by Televisa, was Blue Bondoni. So they did this to support their gay friends at school, fans using a telenovela for the purposes of political action. So I believe that was what you write here, amateur, personal, spontaneous. And that would be a good example of the use of social media.
I guess we have to read your books, Paul, and I mean, we can't thank you enough for doing this. I mean, during this very hard time.
Thank you.
I can't wait to see you all in person back on campus. I mean, that would be really great. I mean, as you know, at the Builder Center, we used to have so many conferences, and we were always very proud to have so many people from different backgrounds. So it's really an honor to be back. So I guess if there are no more questions or comments, we are just going to say so long, and we'll see you next time. Okay. Thank you so much for being with us, and hope to see you very, very, very soon.